What kind of mind is capable of extinguishing the lives of 177 children, one after the other, without hesitation, without remorse? This is not a question meant to provoke fear, but to demand reflection. We are not here to recount horror for its own sake. We are here to try, if only slightly, to understand how a human mind can unravel so completely, yet function with such terrifying precision. Luis Alfredo Garavito, known across Latin America as one of the most prolific serial child killers in recorded history, operated in Colombia throughout the 1990s. His victims were young boys, often poor and vulnerable, lured with promises of food, work, or safety. What followed was methodical, calculated brutality. Bodies were found mutilated, discarded, forgotten, but the scale of his crimes made forgetting impossible. Officially, Garavito confessed to murdering 138 children. However, forensic evidence and investigations later attributed at least 177 murders to him. And yet, the question lingers like a shadow. Was he born this way, or shaped by something far darker? Was this a case of evil, or of a psyche fractured beyond repair before it ever had a chance to form? Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. To begin understanding the mind behind the numbers, we must first return to where the fracture began. Not with the crimes, but with the early silence that surrounded him. The silence surrounding his early years is not just unsettling, it's revealing. Long before the headlines, before the horror, there was a boy growing up in the shadows of violence, neglect, and absolute poverty. Reports suggest Garavito endured relentless physical abuse, sexual assault, and emotional abandonment from a young age. He wasn't raised, he survived. And survival in such conditions doesn't build empathy. It builds walls, hardens instincts, and often leaves no room for the development of what we call conscience. But does understanding this context bring us closer to preventing such acts, or only deeper into the mystery? I would love to hear your view. Your insights help shape this space into what it's meant to be, a place where psychology, not spectacle, leads the conversation. And if you're new here or haven't checked recently, make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. We don't simplify minds like his, we dissect them. If you believe in questioning over judging, this is your space too. Now let's take a step further back, beyond the visible symptoms of a broken adult, and into the formative years, where identity itself is formed or fractured. What does it mean to be raised without emotional mirroring? Without affection, without safety? At what point does a child stop learning what it means to be human and start adapting to survive as something else entirely? That's where the fracture begins. And it's here that we start to see not just the man, but the slow construction of the mind behind him. Now, let's go even deeper into this, into the early fractured landscape where Luis Alfredo Garavito's identity began to take shape. Born in 1957 in Colombia, he was the oldest of 7 children. His father was known to be violently abusive, both physically and emotionally, and there are repeated accounts suggesting Garavito was subjected to sexual abuse from a young age, not only by relatives but also by neighbors. His mother, overwhelmed and emotionally distant, offered no protection. From his earliest years, Garavito was surrounded by domination, humiliation, and a complete absence of safety, a world where survival depended on silence, submission, and emotional detachment. Psychologically, this isn't just trauma, it's transformation. When a child is constantly violated, the mind begins to adapt. Emotional rupture becomes a defense mechanism. Love becomes a foreign concept, and slowly, something essential begins to decay. The ability to recognize pain in others because your own has never been recognized. This isn't empathy being lost. It's empathy never having a chance to form. In court, Garavito once said, "I was a child and no one protected me. So I stopped caring about children. That statement doesn't excuse, it reveals. It shows a mind that conflates pain with power, that reverses vulnerability into domination. It reflects a man who no longer perceived innocence as something to protect, but as something to conquer, perhaps as a twisted reenactment of his own helplessness. Teachers described him as withdrawn, unstable, prone to outbursts. Later psychiatric evaluations confirmed traits of antisocial personality disorder coupled with deep emotional dysregulation. These aren't labels, they are the scars left by years of invisible torment. If this analysis sparked something inside you, leave in the comments. There's always a hidden layer, but there's another hidden layer we need to uncover. The moment when trauma stops being a reaction and becomes structure. Garavito's early experiences didn't simply wound him, they reshaped the architecture of his mind. Over time, fear and humiliation stopped being temporary states. They became constants, around which he built a new identity, one where control replaced vulnerability and cruelty became a language more familiar than compassion. Psychological assessments conducted after his arrest revealed marked traits of antisocial personality disorder, along with strong narcissistic features. Experts noted his complete lack of remorse, even after confessing to the murder of over 130 boys. In several of his taped confessions, Garavito calmly described how he lured children by impersonating authority figures, a teacher, a charity worker, a priest. He said they trusted me. That made it easier. These are not the words of a disorganized or chaotic mind. They reflect planning, manipulation, and most disturbingly, a calculated understanding of human behavior, without any emotional resonance. In court, he appeared compliant, even soft-spoken, often referring to himself in the third person, as if distancing himself from the very actions he orchestrated. This dissociation is not uncommon in individuals with deeply embedded personality disorders. It's a survival mechanism turned inward, not to escape harm, but to escape guilt. So we must ask, if empathy is never taught, can it ever exist? What happens when emotional detachment is not an anomaly, but the default setting of a mind? In Garavito's case, the answer seems to lie in a chilling paradox. He could imitate the outer shell of social behavior, but the internal mechanism that gives those behaviors meaning had long since withered. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. To truly understand how Garavito's identity deteriorated into something so unrecognizable, we need to trace the first visible cracks in his psychological foundation, the moments when the boundaries of empathy, guilt, and restraint began to dissolve. As a teenager, those closest to him began to notice something was wrong. Neighbors later recalled that he was often seen hurting small animals with disturbing detachment. In school, he was known for lying compulsively, stealing from classmates, and creating elaborate false stories to gain pity or control. Yet none of these red flags ever triggered meaningful intervention. Garavito was expelled from multiple schools, yet never received psychiatric attention. He drifted through adolescence with no structure, no accountability, only the growing realization that manipulation gave him power. In his 20s, he attempted to join religious orders, but was repeatedly dismissed for behavioral instability. During one interview, a former church member described him as strangely charming but hollow, like he was imitating emotion rather than feeling it. There were also early brushes with the law. In 1980, he was arrested for inappropriate behavior with minors, but released with no follow-up. Authorities had no centralized system to track such patterns. The warnings were there, scattered, isolated, and ultimately ignored. No institution, no community system, no individual stepped in. And in that silence, his disintegration continued unchecked. In his own words during a taped interrogation, he said, "I kept waiting for someone to stop me. No one did." That statement is haunting, not just because of what it reveals about him, but because of what it says about us. The societal blind spots that allow fractures to widen until they're no longer fractures, but collapse. Now, we move toward the irreversible shift, when thought became action and silence became violence. As we cross into the next phase of this psychological journey, we witness the moment when fantasy crossed the threshold into action, when thoughts once contained began to demand physical expression. For Luis Alfredo Garavito, this transformation didn't happen overnight. It evolved gradually, like a ritual being rehearsed in the shadows of his mind. The earliest known attack, later confirmed through his own confession, occurred in 1992, but police believe the pattern began years earlier. He would spend hours walking through impoverished neighborhoods, watching boys play, memorizing their routines. His method was meticulous. He often wore disguises, a priest, a street vendor, a disabled man, roles that exploited the innocence and trust of his victims. The emotional void that had defined his early life now returned with a new, sinister function. He described the attacks in clinical terms, devoid of emotion. "I felt a peace," he once said during interrogation, "like something that was restless inside me had been silenced." That line, cold and exact, speaks volumes about the mental structure behind the crimes. It wasn't rage, it wasn't chaos. It was control, a distorted sense of power that emerged from years of psychological annihilation. Garavito's need to dominate wasn't impulsive. It was rehearsed, refined. Victims were often restrained, tortured, and in some cases, kept alive for hours. The acts themselves became rituals, repeated patterns that temporarily filled what years of neglect had hollowed out. And yet, behind the brutality was a terrifying order. This was not a man consumed by madness, but one who had constructed a private world where his inner void was momentarily silenced through violence. Is this the product of damaged wiring, of learned cruelty, or both? Are we looking at nature in its darkest form, or nurture twisted beyond recognition? Perhaps the truth lies in the collision of both forces, where psychological emptiness meets opportunity, and the result is nothing less than a human catastrophe. The illusion of invisibility began to unravel in 1999. A pair of eyeglasses found near a shallow grave in the small Colombian town of Villavicencio became the key that led investigators to Luis Alfredo Garavito. The glasses were traced to a specific prescription available only in a limited number of stores, and from there, the net began to close. When authorities finally apprehended him, he appeared unassuming, gaunt, compliant, cooperative. But the story he carried beneath his silence was monstrous. As investigators uncovered mass graves scattered across rural Colombia, Garavito confessed to the murders with chilling calm. He drew maps, identified locations, and described his victims with disturbing precision. "I remember each one," he said, looking straight ahead. "Some faces still visit me in dreams. Others, I forget." Psychiatric evaluations confirmed a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder with deeply ingrained narcissistic and sadistic traits. Experts noted a complete absence of guilt or empathy, yet a sharp, intact cognitive function, a man fully aware of his actions but emotionally severed from their consequences. During his trial, he often referred to himself as a damaged creation, a phrase that sparked debate. Was it an admission, a manipulation, or both? The legal outcome ignited national outrage. Though initially sentenced to more than 1,800 years in prison, Colombian law capped the maximum sentence at 40 years. Further sentence reductions for cooperation and confessions meant Garavito could theoretically be released before his natural death. This revelation caused shock and fury across the country. Citizens protested, families of victims demanded reforms, and Colombia was forced to confront a painful question: what does justice look like when the crime defies comprehension? The controversy exposed a deeper societal wound, one not just about punishment, but about identity, responsibility, and the limits of the system itself. And yet, the story doesn't end with a verdict. The mind behind these crimes continues to challenge what we believe punishment can achieve or undo. Even after hours of confessions, countless court documents, psychological evaluations, and forensic reports, something remains unresolved, an echo that refuses to fade. Garavito's crimes have been dissected, his childhood examined, his mind labeled, yet the central question, what truly creates such a mind, lingers without a definitive answer. Was he born incapable of empathy, or was empathy slowly erased, one trauma at a time? The truth may not lie in one origin, but in the layered collapse of many. What makes this story even more unsettling is its proximity. Garavito operated in towns many considered too small to harbor such horror. He blended in, evading suspicion for years. He laughed with neighbors, bought candy for local children. One shopkeeper described him as always polite, always quiet. It's this contradiction, the familiarity of the monster, that makes the psychological impact even more profound. Could such a transformation happen again? Could it already be happening, just not yet discovered? In the final minutes of his interrogation, Garavito was asked if he felt he was still a danger to society. He looked down and whispered, "The darkness doesn't leave, it only waits." That sentence, more than any clinical report, reveals the truth behind the mask. It is not only about what he did, but what he became. And perhaps that's the hardest truth to confront. That there are minds which mimic humanity but no longer contain it. That sometimes comprehension brings no peace, only more questions. Not everything that is broken can be rebuilt. But what we choose not to examine, we doom ourselves to repeat. If this reflection resonates with you, write below, "The mind hides more than we dare to see." If the layers we've uncovered today stirred something in you, a question, a realization, even just a moment of silence, then I invite you to keep walking this path with us. Every week, here at Criminal Psychology Unmasked, we examine another mind, another life, another descent into the unknown. This is not about shock. It's about understanding what lies beneath behavior most of us can't imagine, and what it reveals about the human condition itself. If you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe. It's not just a button, it's a step into continued inquiry, into peeling back the layers of minds most would rather turn away from. And if you've stayed with me until now, consider leaving a like, not as approval, but as acknowledgement of the importance of looking where it hurts. I'd also love to hear your voice in this conversation. Right below, the labyrinth never ends. Because truly, every reflection here adds depth to what we're building together. A space where questioning takes the place of judgment. The human mind remains an endless labyrinth, and every case we explore only reveals how fragile the line between reality and darkness can be. In our next journey, we'll dive into another mind, shaped by forces just as hidden, just as powerful. I'll be waiting for you in the next video.